There's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamamia podcast.
Mamamia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast is recorded on.
This episode deals with issues of self-harm and suicide. If this is triggering for you, give this one a miss. And if you need to speak to someone, reach out to Lifeline on 13 11 14.
Is the name you propose to use for the purpose of giving evidence in this inquiry Catherine James?
Yes, it is.
That is not your correct name.
No, it is not.
It's 1987, and Catherine James sits in a witness box. Her name is a pseudonym, given to protect her from an insidious, endemic web of police corruption that's been ruling Queensland's streets across 4 decades. Partially obscured from the watching eyes of the courtroom by a wooden panel, Catherine wears a disguise, a wig. By trade, she's a brothel madam, and she's the 4th Brisbane sex worker who has tried to blow the lid on the Rat Pack, a group of crooked cops who've been taking kickbacks from workers in exchange for protection. Dorothy has already tried. Shirley spoke out. Simone did too. 2 will die shortly afterwards in mysterious circumstances, but Catherine isn't backing down. She's about to dish on every crooked cop, every dirty deal, every wrong turn. She's about to drop a bombshell on Queensland police, unveiling a sinister world of deception, corruption, manipulation and allegedly murder. I'm Gemma Bath, and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamamia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. In today's episode, I'm speaking with prize-winning Australian novelist and journalist Matt Condon. Matt's been investigating the disappearance of sex workers linked to a trio of notoriously corrupt policemen who became known as Queensland's Rat Pack. His findings, which he'll overview for us today, are laid out in full in his podcast Dig, Sirens Are Coming. Matt, tell me about Dorothy Knight. What was she doing with herself in Sydney in the 1960s?
Dorothy is one of the most extraordinary characters I've ever met in journalism, and she's 80 now. She's still a great friend. Dorothy was a sort of low-level shyster, if you like. She was passing forged checks in the early to mid-1960s. She was in and out of prison, both in Brisbane and briefly in Melbourne, and then decided she would start a new life up in Queensland, befriended one of the most corrupt officers of not only his day, but any day in Australian criminal history, and that was Glendon Patrick Hallahan. So she settled into Brisbane and began working as a sex worker in the city.
Let's paint the picture of Hallahan at the time. Who was he in the Queensland Police Force in the 1960s?
Okay, so in the late 1950s, another corrupt officer by the name of Frank Bischoff secured the position of Commissioner of Police. Now, you know, the word is still to this day that he had the goods on a number of politicians and managed to get the big chair, if you like, via that information. But he took 3 young police officers under his wing, and they subsequently became the master's apprentices and became known around town colloquially as the Rat Pack. That was Glendon Patrick Hallahan, who was a detective, very tall, very handsome, according to all reports. Tony Murphy, another powerful figure in the force. And then, of course, Terence Murray Lewis. Now, Lewis would go on himself to become Commissioner of Police from 1976. So you've got this cabal of officers who are willing to do the bidding of their boss, Frank Bischoff, back in that period.
Do we know how Bischoff convinced these 3 men to do that, or even sussed out that they'd be willing in the first place?
That's an incredibly good question, and it's an incredibly complicated one to answer. How did they come under the spell of Bischoff? A number of explanations have been given down the years, and none are entirely satisfactory. There are always people, especially back then, there was opportunity for corruption infinitely greater than you would have today in a modern force with modern technology, et cetera, et cetera. It's almost by osmosis that those who went on the take, if you like, birds of a feather stick together. So there's that possibility. These three men also saw a great future under Frank Bischoff. He would remain commissioner for 11 years until he finally literally lost his mind and was in fact arrested a couple of years after he left the force for shoplifting in Brisbane City, and the Crown decided it wouldn't be in the public interest to have our former commissioner face court on charges of shoplifting. But, he was a very, very powerful and deeply corrupt man. And, once these three young men got in the swim, they were there for good.
Do we know if the rest of the force had kind of cottoned onto it around this time, or even the public, or were they kind of doing it really secretly?
Well, Brisbane was a small town in the 50s and 60s, and certainly I've spoken to many dozens of retired police officers. You knew it was happening, but you didn't ask questions. If you did, you could find yourself literally being posted to Longreach or Mount Isa or Charleville. If you were straight and not corrupt, you kept your head down, you did your best. But there was certainly a knowledge between those who were on the take and those who weren't, absolutely unequivocally. In terms of the public, that's another really interesting psychological factor of the era. If the public know, just by nature of going about their business in this, what was then a smallish city, village gossip and word gets around. There was a saying back even in the 1960s about the National Hotel, which would become this notorious centre point of a Royal Commission in 1963 in terms of police misconduct at that hotel and whether sex workers were actually working out of the hotel as their sort of business office, if you like. And the word around town was that, even school children knew what was going on inside the walls of the National. So, but then again, how do you explain decades of, individuals trying to rise up and bring attention to the corruption? But in terms of en masse for the community, there seemed to have been an attitude of turn a blind eye, very much so.
Let's get back to Dorothy and use her to kind of show what these men were doing, because she starts to get involved with sex work and she's rubbing shoulders with Hallahan. Tell me about their setup and in what capacity she was working with and for him.
So Hallahan went about one of his old tricks, and that was he was involved with Dorothy Edith Knight's arrest in Queensland way back when, as she was arrested in Townsville. And for some strange reason, as will become evident, Hallahan sort of befriended Dorothy and said, look, when you get out of jail from this charge, give me a ring, which is exactly what she did. You certainly cannot blame a young woman like Dorothy Edith Knight. She's fresh out of prison. And who does she know? She happens to know a policeman named Glenn Hallahan. Certainly, if you're in the sex game, it may be an advantage to have a friend on the inside of the police force. So this is how Hallahan would get his talons into these young women. And before they knew it, he owned them in the sense that they were earning him income. So she would kick back $20 a week to Hallahan. Now, it doesn't sound a lot today. It was a lot then. And when you think that Dorothy was turning tricks at the National Hotel for anywhere up to $60 to $80 per client, it's not an insubstantial figure when weeks grow into months, grow into years. So in a sense, too, she felt that, there was very little she could do without his permission. And this is how these relationships evolve. There's almost a distinct ownership of this woman as a piece of money-generating property, in a sense, as hard as that is to believe today.
And at the time, did she just accept that this is what you had to do, or did she have an idea that, it was criminal, that it was wrong that he was doing that?
Well, look, she did accept it, and she says in the podcast that they developed a friendship, and this is what Hallahan did as well with other women like Shirley Margaret Briffman. They would sometimes have a drink together, have a scotch and ice in the National Hotel before everyone got down to work. They would share gossip about the criminal milieu, what was going on, who was doing what. So a sense of trust and, from these women's point of view, a degree of an actual friendship. But then over time, when the money starts mounting and the demands continue ceaselessly, I've researched this in a few instances. Women like Dorothy Briffman and indeed another famous sex worker in Queensland called Simone Vogel, but we'll come to her, they do reach a breaking point threshold where they go, well, why am I working so hard and just handing over part of my profits to these corrupt police? Why should I be doing that? And that's exactly the point that Dorothy Edith Knight reached in 1971.
What were these cops doing with the money? Were they flashing it around? Was that obvious? Were they living lavish lifestyles?
Well, when you speak to all of the straight or non-corrupt police, they always said to me over and over and over, you could always tell the ones that were on the take, the police that were taking kickbacks, because they all had beautiful clothing. They just stood out from the rest of the force. They could afford nice things, cars, holidays. It was patently obvious that they were getting income from another stream other than the Queensland Police Force.
You mentioned a bit earlier the Royal Commission into the National Hotel, which was the hotel that Dorothy and some of these other women were working out of. How did that come about? How did there even come to be a Royal Commission in the first place?
Yes, well, it was the first ever Royal Commission into police misconduct in Queensland. So around October 1963, a wonderful politician by the name of Colin Bennett, he was the member for Kurilpa or South Brisbane. His electorate was mainly for people familiar with Brisbane, sort of the West End area, just, in the inner west of the city. An ALP man, devoted to public service, and he also happened to be a very effective lawyer. Now, Bennett wins the seat of Kurilpa, but he also has this extraordinary side to him where he opens the doors to his chambers every Saturday for disadvantaged people, Indigenous people, sex workers who might be having trouble with the law and need some advice. And he would do that pro bono, an extraordinary figure. And as these sex workers were coming in and telling him tales of corruption and the National Hotel and all of the shenanigans that were going on in there, he took that knowledge into Parliament. And so in October, he actually stood to give a now famous speech about corruption within the police force. And he just mentioned in one little paragraph how the police commissioner, Frank Bischoff, ought to spend some time enforcing the law in relation to sex workers working out of the National Hotel rather than indulging in it. That one phrase about the commissioner essentially ignoring illegality in front of his eyes in that hotel caused an absolute furor in the press the next day. And the Conservative government under Premier Frank Nicklin made a risky decision that there would be a Royal Commission into the police behaviour in that establishment. So that kicked off with witnesses around December 1963 and went into 1964.
You mentioned a name earlier, Shirley. She becomes one of the star witnesses at that commission. Is that one of the downfalls of the commission? Is her testimony the reason nothing comes of it or nothing happens?
Again, I think there are a few reasons why it was a wet squib, if I could call it that, as a Royal Commission. Shirley Briffman came from Atherton in far north Queensland. She hooked up with a man called Sonny Briffman. They married and had a daughter and moved to Brisbane in around 1958, so not long after Bischoff became commissioner, and she started working out of what they used to call a house of ill repute, Kalani's, over in the inner city. She becomes acquainted with the Rat Pack. She develops friendships, particularly with Tony Murphy and Glenn Hallahan, and then begins working out of the National Hotel, along with Dorothy Edith Knight and others. And when the Royal Commission is called, Shirley is the much anticipated star witness. I mean, this is Shirley Briffman. Isn't she a sex worker? She's a sex worker, right? That's the rumours swirling around town. Now, she gets into the witness box and flatly denies she is a sex worker. She says she's only pokes her nose into the National Hotel once every 6 months, when in fact she's probably working out of there 5 nights a week, and perjured herself outrageously at the inquiry, which caused, again, a public ruckus. What we learn much later is that, in fact, her evidence to the Royal Commission was totally coached by Murphy and Hallahan. And she was not only given the answers that she was supposed to answer to these questions, she was given the questions themselves as well. So you have a total setup and complete perjury from Shirley Briffman in order to divert attention away from the corrupt police, and it worked a treat. The inquiry virtually fell into this sort of lunacy and lost any form of traction or momentum. And then a few months later, Justice Gibbs issued his report, which found, quote, no evidence of police misconduct whatsoever.
So is it just business as usual? It just goes back to how it was?
It was worse than business as usual because Bischoff and his apprentices had managed to outwit an actual royal commission. What that did was embolden them. They learnt a hell of a lot from their behaviour in that commission, what worked, what didn't, and they moved forward with total confidence and indeed, some would say, hubris.
In the late 60s, Bischoff is replaced. Is he pushed? How does that happen? Because he kind of has this control and then suddenly he's gone.
He had a number of controversies throughout his commissionership, although nothing unseated him, until the end of the 1960s, when a parliamentarian called Thomas Hiley indicated that he had gathered a substantial amount of evidence in relation to Frank Bischoff's corruption. Now, as I understand it, Bischoff was given an alternative. You either retire gracefully or you get pushed in an unceremonious public manner, and he chose the former.
So who was he replaced by? Not another crooked cop, I hope?
Well, he was very, very briefly by a police officer and one of his deputies called Norm Bauer, but he was only in the job for a matter of months before the government realised that it needed to maybe shake up the force. In the tremors following Bischoff's chaotic reign, they decided to look for someone else outside of Queensland and try and get some reforming happening. And they chose an extraordinary man called Ray Whitrod. Now, Whitrod had worked for what we later knew as ASIO post-World War II, and he was the police commissioner of Papua New Guinea, and he was essentially headhunted for the job. He was brought down to Brisbane, and of course the word was that he was picked up by an officer at the airport and driven to his accommodation in the city. And during the course of that car ride, Whitrod was filled in on the doings of this group known as the Rat Pack and others. So he was essentially pre-warned about what he was about to get into, although he had absolutely no idea, poor Ray Whitrod, what he was in for. He was an extremely straight, God-fearing, intelligent individual. He tried and tried and tried with numerous reforms. He wanted more women in the police force to counter this sort of consistent misogyny. He wanted to, get the force educated because, a lot of the police up to that date, I think the average age of police officers leaving school was 12 or 13 years of age. Terence Murray Lewis left school at the age of 12, went on to become commissioner. So Whitrod wanted to educate the men and women of the force to tighten that area up. But he faced a very powerful group of people. There was constant meetings of the union, votes of lack of confidence. He had truckloads of gravel tipped onto his driveway in the middle of the night. He had doctors turning up and ambulances turning up looking for Ray Whitrod, who was someone phoned in and said he was suspected of having a heart attack. There were all these pranks and terrible things that went on to the point where Whitrod actually slept with a gun under his bed.
And during this time, you can kind of tell by what was happening to Whitrod, but the Rat Pack was, they were out there firing on all cylinders.
Whitrod tried very, very hard to smash this group known as the Rat Pack. So what he did in 1971, and this is where Dorothy Edith Knight and Shirley Briffman come into it so strongly, Whitrod formed a group called the Crime Intelligence Unit. So this was a hand-picked group of honest men who were to go after specifically the Rat Pack and see if he couldn't break that down and loosen their power. With Murphy was charged with that old perjury from the National Hotel Inquiry in 63, 64. So he was suspended from the force. So there's one down. Dorothy Edith Knight, of course, was involved in an incredibly famous sting operation where she entrapped Hallahan at the end of 1971. So he was charged and taken down. So he had 2 out of 3, but it didn't go to plan, unfortunately.
Let's go back to that sting, because that was the first time that Queensland used a wire. Can you take us through what happened and how Dorothy was involved?
Yes, so and I've spoken at length to Dorothy late last year. We went together to roughly the park bench in New Farm Park in Brisbane, where the sting took place 50 years earlier. It was an amazing moment. She was filled with emotion. She was, on the edge of tears. She hadn't been back since that phenomenal moment. But the unit I mentioned earlier, the Crime Intelligence Unit, in late 1971, just turned up at Dorothy's home and said, look, this is what we're thinking. We want to bring down Hallahan and we want you to be a part of this operation. Now, because of various things that were happening to Dorothy in her life, she was doubting Hallahan. She was learning more and more about the corruption he was deeply involved in, including rumours of murder. So she was dissatisfied with that, and she thought, well, what the heck, I'll do it. So they trained her for a couple of months. They went through the scenario over and over and over. And indeed, they installed the first wire ever used in Queensland. It sounds a bit Keystone Cops today, but it was a matchbox with a microphone in it and a wire taped to her body. Somebody forgot to check the batteries in the device, so they went flat pretty quickly in the middle of this life-threatening operation. There was a caravan parked at the edge of New Farm Park, and inside were members of the CIU watching with binoculars and taking photos. And New Farm Park was that day filled with gardeners, men mowing lawns. They were all undercover police, just waiting for the sting to go down. Hallahan walked straight into it. I mean, whether it was just his high view of himself, untouchable, he took the money, it was photographed, and he was arrested on the spot. Dorothy fainted at that moment of arrest. I mean, here she is betraying someone she's known for years and had a friendship with, and suddenly she's working for the enemy. By reputation, he's an incredibly violent human being. So she was literally putting her life on the line there.
Shirley went with a different tactic. Instead of getting the police involved, she went straight to the media, didn't she?
Yes, she did. So Shirley had been paying off certainly Queensland Police from the late 50s through to just after the National Hotel Inquiry and beyond. But then at the recommendation of Tony Murphy and others, they suggested until the National Hotel dust settled down that she relocate to Sydney, which is exactly what she did. And in short shrift became one of the most notorious brothel keepers in Sydney vice history. She was incredibly successful. She was earning an enormous amount of money, still paying off corrupt police, but now paying off New South Wales Police as well as Queensland Police. And that was simply for protection from arrest, that she would not be arrested. And indeed, in her entire lengthy career, right up until 1971, Shirley had never been arrested, charged, and seen 1 minute's time inside a prison cell. But in 1971, she's charged with procuring an underage female for sexual exploitation, and she's actually charged and put into prison. Now, she is shocked, stunned. She can't believe she's been paying off police for 13 years and she's sitting in a prison cell. So there were complications about getting her bail, so she had to sit in jail longer than she expected. But when she came out, she made that decision that she was going to blow the whistle and bring them all down. This was her revenge. So she did. She went to a then popular ABC TV current affairs show called This Day Tonight. She was interviewed on air by a reporter that some people may remember, Gerald Stone, who was instrumental in setting up 60 Minutes in Australia. And while they couldn't go into specific names for reasons of defamation at the time, she told Australia that she'd been paying off these corrupt police, and this is what was happening. It was as good as signing your own death warrant as you could really get. I mean, it's hard to understand. I do understand her revenge motive. I certainly don't understand the view there might not be very serious repercussions from that act.
Well, that was 1971. And then in 1972, on March 4, Shirley is found dead. And I know that this is something you've been looking into at length, but what do we know about her death? Is it suspicious?
Okay, so We were speaking earlier about Tony Murphy being charged with perjury stemming from the National Hotel Inquiry. Tony Murphy's court appearance on those charges was in April 1972. The chief witness against him was expected to be Shirley Margaret Briffman. She came back to Brisbane after the This Day Tonight appearance, which was in mid-1971. She was interviewed repeatedly by Queensland Police and New South Wales detectives about her corruption allegations, and that went right through until about November of 1971. I feel for her. She must have hit the wall in terms she'd lost her empire in Sydney. She was now conducting regular and lengthy interviews with police about what she alleged on TV. She was depressed. A good friend of hers in early 72 died of cancer. She tried to take her own life on a couple of occasions. Leading up to that famous day in March 1972, her children found her body in the front room of an apartment in Bonnie Avenue in a Sydney inner northern suburb of Clayfield. Now, police swarmed the Bonnie Avenue property. There were detectives and police coming and going in and out of the room where the body still sat. There was no attempt at protecting the scene for possible skullduggery in terms of her death. The death was recommended by police that there be no inquest because she was a sex worker and she had a history of drug taking and she'd attempted her own life before, and this was pure and simple a successful suicide attempt. And that's where it stood for many, 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 many years until more recent times where various reporting and agitation from the Briffman family, it looked like there might finally be an inquest into Shirley Briffman's death. To date, it hasn't transpired.
So that's still an open question, and Murphy gets away. He doesn't have to face his day in court. What about Hallahan? Because something similar happens there. His charges don't stick?
His charges don't stick. The evidence from the wonky wire is not admissible in court. The only charges he faces are very minor police administrative internal charges in terms of not keeping his police notebook up to date and stuff like that. He ultimately, though, once he's given the all clear and claims that he was never corrupt and these charges should never have been laid against him, he retires from the police force. But he doesn't retire from various dodgy dealings that continue in his life.
We've come so close to getting this rat pack disbanded, and then we get to this point and one of them becomes commissioner, right? And everyone else kind of gets really big positions again in the force. Take us through what happens next, what positions the rat packers end up with at the end of all of this.
Yes, so Ray Whitrod faced almost 6 years of unrelenting criticism. You name it, they threw it at Whitrod until November 1976. Bear in mind, in the meantime, Tony Murphy is, because of Shirley Briffman's death, the trial evaporates and he goes about his business as a detective. Terry Lewis has been working for years in the Juvenile Aid Bureau. He's a survivor. But Whitrod still trying his best to break up this, well, there are two left now, Murphy and Lewis. He transfers Murphy out to Longreach in far northwestern Queensland, and he transfers Lewis to Charleville in Western Queensland to minimise their contact and thus their potency as a duo. It in fact has the opposite effect. They communicate at will with each other and plot and plan behind Whitrod's back out in these rural regions. But in late 1976, the appointment of a deputy to Whitrod comes up, and as it transpires, Terence Murray Lewis, the junior inspector from Charleville, suddenly gets the green light for the position. And I mean, this is almost unthinkable that Whitrod's been trying for years to emasculate the Rat Pack, and now the government is proposing that they put Lewis directly under him as his deputy. As a result, Whitrod resigns, and there's huge controversy, and Lewis simply shunts up to the big chair and becomes Commissioner of Police under Premier Joh Bjelke-Petersen.
I want to introduce Simone Vogel here because, as you call her, she becomes the new queen, the new madam of the 70s. How do the Rat Pack use her to continue their crooked ways? Because now they're back on top.
So she came from Sydney. She worked successfully as a sex worker in Sydney and ultimately became the sidekick to a gangster by the name of Joe Borg, who owned and ran innumerable brothels in Sydney in the 60s. Borg himself is killed, blown to pieces in a car bomb outside his home around North Bondi in the late 60s. So Vogel very prudently decides, this town's getting a little bit hot for me. I'll try my luck in Queensland. So she comes to Brisbane. And the genius of Simone Vogel was that she was a fantastic business person. So she saw in Brisbane this sort of sad cottage industry of, there weren't proper places for sex workers to work. It was like an empty room with a massage table in the middle. With her experience from Sydney, she very astutely began to purchase premises, and she started kitting out these amazing boudoirs, if you like. So she turned them into places of not just sex work, but entertainment, put in, bars where clients could come and have a drink. There were saunas, plush carpet on the floors, themed rooms in these establishments. And she very, very quickly revolutionised the sex trade in Brisbane and became very wealthy very quickly on the back of that.
But I guess if Simone is being very successful and earning a lot of money, that means a lot more money is being funneled, isn't it, to these cops? So how does she deal with that?
Well, she dealt with it the way people like Dorothy, Edith Knight, and everyone up and down the chain dealt with it. She, in order to operate, she had to kick back. So, and you're absolutely right. The more money she earned, the bigger the kickback. So she was a very prized target for corrupt police from those early 1970s into the mid-70s. She was paying phenomenal amounts of money. I remember her brother telling me that it was, just bear in mind, this is the 1970s, at some points in excess of $40,000 a month. Now, I remember my parents bought a house in Brisbane in 1972 and it cost $11,000. You're looking at vast amounts of cash. She had several parlours, both in Brisbane and on the Gold Coast. She ran them like an extraordinary business person. She clearly had great skills in that direction. The more she earned, the bigger the scoop off. So by 1976, 77, she was getting very dissatisfied with the arrangement.
But Simone doesn't really get a chance to kind of use that dissatisfaction because in 1977, she goes missing. What do we know about what happened?
So Simone based herself on the Gold Coast, and in September 1977, she drove to Brisbane and she asked some of her employees at two of her establishments that she needed to get together a certain amount of cash because she was having a meeting with an individual. Now, one of the administrative workers at one of these brothels overheard her on the phone saying to this person at the other end of the line, let's meet in the same place that we did last time. So here was a prearranged meeting for that Friday evening, I think around 6 o'clock. Nobody knows who was on the end of the phone. Nobody knows what the meeting was about. But given Simone had gathered, I think, about $6,000 in cash, and she was also wearing a substantial amount of her own personal jewellery at that time, she goes off to the meeting and she has not been seen or heard from since that day.
Now, police originally said that they suspected her husband, but there were no charges there, were there? There was nothing that actually happened.
No, there wasn't. So I was very fortunate to have been able to, again, befriend and interview at length over the years a wonderful, honest detective by the name of Keith Smith. Keith was in police Brisbane headquarters on the Sunday after that Friday, so that's in 77. Keith was just on duty, and a woman called Marcia Barnard came into headquarters to report that her boss, Simone Vogel, appeared to have gone missing. So Keith had the job, and he began a very serious investigation into what happened to this woman. He interviewed countless people, flew to Sydney to interview Simone's family, and spent over a year investigating the disappearance of Simone. He came to the conclusion that there may have been police involved in the disappearance, and that is police specifically from the licensing branch. And it was the licensing branch corrupt officers that were the ones that collected the kickback money from the sex workers. So Keith Smith ascertained that the police may have been involved, which was an extraordinary allegation to think that, I mean, this woman, they suspected she was murdered very, very soon after she disappeared. It didn't remain a missing persons case for long at all. They believe she was murdered. Keith thought, from his investigations, police may be involved here. He took this report to his senior officers. One of them included Tony Murphy. And Murphy informed Keith and his partner that as investigators, they couldn't see the wood for the trees. That was his comment, that they were looking in the wrong place for the perpetrator and that they needed to focus on Simone Vogel's husband, Stephen Pavich. So that's where all the hullabaloo came. You know, Pavich murdered his own wife. He wanted to control the empire, take the money for himself. He was a hopeless alcoholic, all of these allegations flying around. But it was simply, again, to divert attention from the main game. Again, we see tactics from Murphy that work so well in the National Hotel Inquiry. You blow up a hand grenade over on the left-hand side of the room so that people don't look and see what's really going on the other side of the room. And that's a similar tactic here with Pavich. There was never a single charge of murder or anything of that gravity against Stephen Pavich. It was just an absolute furphy.
Matt, the next woman we need to talk about is Catherine James. She's the next madam of prominence to take on the Rat Pack, and she was around the 70s and 80s. That's when she was of prominence in Queensland. Was she involved in the same situation as all of the other women that we've been talking about?
Look, again, it's very similar in that there is this pattern of behaviour, and these women, they earn the money that makes the entire machine work. They earn these vast fortunes. They kick back to these men who do very little for the rewards, if not nothing, just simply put their hands out. You have this inequity of power. So you've got, in all instances, incredibly intelligent women who are capable of running multi-million-dollar businesses. It just so happens that this is sex work, and I don't think that should ever be prejudiced against them whatsoever. But you've got very smart women having to kick back to a lot of ill-educated, corrupt, and morally bankrupt police officers. You can see the scales simply don't balance. But, in that period and since, sex workers are viewed as, morally spurious. Can't believe a word that comes out of their mouths. They're all liars. So you have Catherine James, again, another extraordinarily intelligent woman who steps into this scene, incredibly capable business person, knows the system inside out, and goes to open her own franchise. Corrupt police take payment for that and then don't allow her to open. They rip her off and they harass her and make her life hell. And she comes to the same conclusion that Shirley did, that Dorothy did, that appears Simone may have done. She's gone, enough is enough. I'm not taking this anymore. So she becomes the very early star witness in the Fitzgerald inquiry into police and political corruption in 1987.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Gemma Bath. I'm speaking with journalist Matt Condon about a trio of corrupt policemen who dominated the streets of Queensland from the late 50s through to the late 80s. How did the Fitzgerald inquiry come along? Because Catherine, this is such a different situation. We've seen Dorothy, Shirley and Simone all try, and then Catherine gets in this witness box and she just goes for it, doesn't she? How do we even get to this point?
You're right. It took decades to get there. And bear in mind, the inquiry was called in 87. That's 23 years after the conclusion of the National Hotel Inquiry. So these guys had a free run for 2.5 decades until the Fitzgerald Inquiry. And that came about, it's been described to me by the great journalist Chris Masters of the ABC's Four Corners, who did his extraordinary work on his program, The Moonlight State, which went to air in May 1987 and thus triggered the Fitzgerald inquiry. But he described to me, Chris Masters, that many, many journalists had tried before to gain traction on this and had failed. But his situation was that it was the perfect storm that just happened, which caused the inquiry to actually go ahead. So Joe Bjelke-Petersen was out of the country when the Moonlight State went to air. The acting premier was Deputy Bill Gunn. There was no love lost between him and his premier, Joe Bjelke-Petersen. So Gunn made the decision the next day that there would be a royal commission into the allegations on the Moonlight State. Oh, and the choice of Tony Fitzgerald QC as commissioner was, with hindsight, an absolute stroke of genius. He was brilliant, unwavering, sharp as a tack, and did an extraordinary job. But it took a couple of months before witnesses were actually entering that room in the district court building at the beginning of the inquiry. And Catherine James was one of the early witnesses. It amazes me to this day how quickly the House of Cards collapsed after a credible, genuine witness like Catherine James. She'd worked inside this corrupt system for 10 years. She knew it inside out. She knew all the players, who they were paying off, how much money was going where. She had it all. And police started like rats jumping a ship almost instantly.
Well, it became kind of like a domino effect. They just dobbed on each other.
There's nothing like solidarity in the brotherhood when you're facing a blowtorch, you know. They reached out almost instinctively for indemnity from prosecution, which a lot of them got. And it's a good description. It was a domino effect, very, very swift. And the whole thing collapsed like a very bad souffle. And left holding the cards was Commissioner Terence Murray-Lewis.
So what happens to him? He's charged, isn't he?
He's charged. He is suspended from duty. When the inquiry wrapped up in 1989, when the final report was issued, then the DPP made their decision on who they would charge out of this whole fiasco, and they charged Mr. Lewis with several counts of official corruption. And he therefore had to await trial. So he was ultimately tried in 1991 and he was sent to jail for almost 10 years.
What about Murphy and Hallahan? Did they ever see their day?
Hallahan never appeared as a witness before the Royal Commission. He died in 1991. He'd been ill for many, many years with cancer. Murphy issued an official statement to the inquiry, but he too was never called before it. And Murphy left the force at the end of 1982 and he died in 2010. So you've still got the last man standing, and that's Terry Lewis. I understand he's in an assisted living facility in the inner northwest of Brisbane. I sat down and interviewed Terry for 3 years for a series of books I wrote on corruption in Queensland. He never once accepted blame for corruption. He never conceded once that he had been involved in corruption. He blamed, of course, Tony Fitzgerald. He blamed Bill Gunn. He blamed everybody but himself.
Was this the end of all of the corruption? We kind of got a new everything, didn't we? There was a new government, a new premier, a new commissioner. It was kind of like a clean slate. Was it a clean slate?
Well, historically, it was open heart surgery. I don't think any other society in Australia has gone through what Queenslanders went through post-Fitzgerald. An extraordinary impact on the community. The Nationals were swept out of power. Mind you, the last premier in that period, Mike Ahern, he vowed to institute every recommendation of the Fitzgerald inquiry. He kept to his word and he did that. Mike turned 80 last week. He's an extraordinary man, one of the most thoroughly decent human beings I've ever met. He's a great public figure in Queensland. Queenslanders should always thank him for his unbelievable honesty, just a great bloke. So the Goss government was swept in, reforms were made left, right and centre. But, you know, I'll never forget interviewing the former Queensland Premier, Peter Beattie, who we were discussing cycles of corruption. He believed that that sort of broom that sweeps out all the bad stuff, it lasts about 2.5 generations and then it starts to creep back in. Now, I found that a very interesting observation. If you count 2.5 generations from the Fitzgerald inquiry, you're getting pretty close to that expiry date that he talks about. So there's a lot of integrity questions at the moment about the Queensland government, mainly driven by a frustrated opposition, but I can't see any wholesale police corruption happening on the level that it did, because what the Rat Pack and what these old guys did was that they developed and worked a system that worked very, very well for them. But that worked really well for them in the 1950s, 60s and 70s. Now, you simply could not lower the template of that sort of corrupt system over modern Australia. I mean, it's just so old-fashioned. It's not giving concession in any way to, reforms within the force itself, modern technology, etc., etc. I think Queensland Police Force would be as strong and as vigorous in its attempts to keep any corruption out of its ranks as any other state in Australia. I mean, you could not have said that 30 years ago. In fact, you could have said the opposite. But also Queenslanders, and especially the Queensland Police Service, given that terrible reputation that they've come from and had to live with and still live with to this day, the incentive for them to be almost overtly anti-corrupt, you would think, is there, that they have to prove themselves twice as much as any police force, given that terrible stain on their history. But I think they're finally moving on from that. And in fact, I've done a number of book launches where I've had a chance to talk to the younger generation of the Queensland Police Force, and you can already see that this generation, the younger generation, are leaving the past behind and are moving forward.
Matt, I want to end with the women of this story, because to me, this is a story about brave women who tried and tried and tried to show this corruption for what it was. And two of those women are no longer here with us. But tell me about Dorothy and Catherine. What do we know about them today? I know that Dorothy in particular isn't overly happy with the way things ended with her.
No, Dorothy has had, quite frankly, terrible health issues, some of them stemming from the events of 1971. So that changed her life. She had no idea what she was getting into. She said she wouldn't have done it if she knew how her life would pan out, because she dared to stand up and do the right thing. So Catherine James, a great mate of mine, another famous Queensland Police whistleblower, Nigel Powell, who appeared on the Moonlight State, had enough courage to be one of the only ex-police to actually stand up and say, this is what I saw, this is how corrupt it was. He had a long-standing relationship and friendship with Catherine James when he was a policeman, and beyond that, we can't disclose where she lives because she's still a protected identity. Believe it or not, there are still people who would like to know where Catherine James is. But she lives in a Queensland rural community, contributes enormously to that community, has had a family, and has got on with her life to an extent. But she too is unwell, I'm told, at the moment. So it is an extraordinary story about 4 unbelievable women. They all have a similar objective, irrespective of how they earn their money or what they've done in that side of their life. They're all trying to do the right thing, to do the moral thing, and end this insidious cycle of corruption. 2 of them paid for it with their lives, and 2 are still with us, but aging and ailing. And I think, I hope when people hear their stories, they will be open-minded enough to say, in short, thank you for what you did.
Matthew Condon is a prize-winning journalist and novelist who's written 10 books of fiction, as well as a best-selling true crime trilogy about Queensland crime and corruption. He began his journalism career with the Gold Coast Bulletin in 1984, and since then has worked for leading newspapers and journals, including the Sydney Morning Herald, the Sun Herald, Melbourne's Sydney Age, and the Courier Mail. In recent years, he's turned his skills to podcasting. He's the host of Ghost Gate Road, as well as ABC's new podcast series Dig, Sirens Are Coming. You'll find a link to it in our show notes. True Crime Conversations is a Mamamia podcast hosted by me, Gemma Bath, and my executive producer is Gia Moylan. If you've been enjoying our recent episodes, let us know. Send an email to truecrime@mamamia.com.au or leave us a review on your favourite podcast app. It helps other true crime lovers find our content and lets us know what you love about the show.